by the entity in Karachi. Right, sir, but he's saying that he's planning and he said, I will let you know. You just tell the pilot to get directly in touch with the entity Karachi.
Hey guys, today I want to talk about Pervez Musharraf, who was of course the military dictator and president of Pakistan between 1999 and 2008. His proponents would say that he was one of the best rulers that Pakistan has ever had, likening him to the likes of Ayub Khan, who was another military dictator who saw an unprecedented era of economic growth. His detractors would say that he was a military dictator, full stop, and his legacy doesn't really need to be discussed because he irrecoverably damaged the institutions of democracy. So as you guys have seen, he came to power in pretty dramatic fashion, where he was landing his plane from an official tour of duty into Karachi from Sri Lanka, and there was a back and forth between his military confidant, who was also a general, and the ground staff that had been instructed by Nawaz Sharif and his team to not let the plane land. Of course, the plane did land and Musharraf took over the country with a subsequent military coup. He then addressed the nation in which he said that he would restore democracy and democratic institutions as soon as possible. But of course that didn't really happen, and he actually stayed in power for 9 further years. The reason I want to talk about it today is because a special court in Pakistan actually found Musharraf guilty of high treason. Now that is unprecedented in a country like Pakistan, with a very close relationship between governance and the military establishment. So for one of their own to actually be sentenced to death is an unprecedented thing, and something which I think is very interesting. So I want to talk about this in 3 parts. The first is the war on terror, which not only will define Musharraf's tenure in power, but will also define Pakistan's entry into the 21st century. The second are his policies and how they've impacted the Pakistani political landscape and how they continue to impact Pakistan as a nation today. And finally, I want to talk about the identity questions that Musharraf's rule clearly left the country with. So after 9/11, George Bush made the bold statement, you are either with us or you are against us. Now, of course, that was a statement made for the entire world, but nowhere felt that more acutely than Pakistan, which had a tough choice to make. Do you join George Bush's war on terror, or do you become an internationally reclusive state, a pariah state? Now, Musharraf obviously made the former choice. He said that we'll join you in your war on terror. Now, ostensibly in the first couple of years, despite it being controversial at the time, he actually reaped some economic benefits from it. Not only did America actually send through a $6 billion aid package, but also the sanctions that had been in place since 1999 after Pakistan's initial nuclear tests, they were lifted also. So there was a sudden boost to the economy. But in the years afterwards, it became clear that the cons far outweighed the pros, with the dollar cost being about 120 billion for Pakistan, and of course 60,000 people dying in the war on terror. And also, the war on terror kind of led to Pakistan's legitimacy and trustworthiness being irrecoverably damaged on the international scene. Of course, famously, Osama bin Laden was found within Pakistani borders in 2011, and everyone has very big suspicions that maybe the military establishment and even Musharraf knew that this was the case all along. Now I want to talk about his policies. A lot of people would say that this conversation is illegitimate because a military dictator is a military dictator, and it almost doesn't matter what he does in office. The fact that he deprived people of democracy, the fact that he deprived people of the right to choose is enough to define his legacy, and any discussion beyond that is really irrelevant. Now, I have a lot of sympathy for that view, but I think it's interesting that a couple of policies that he put into place actually have consequences today. The first of which is media freedoms, and ironically, that's something that destroyed him in the end. He created an environment where Pakistan went from having 3 or 4 major channels to having about 200 plus across regions and across languages. Now, of course, he didn't keep tabs on them in the way that other dictators do, and eventually that destroyed him, because when he started to do so, that led to an environment where people were not having it. The second thing was education. In a country which spends its money on the wrong things often, it was refreshing for people to have seen a doubling of federal education expenditure, and it became about 2.4% of GDP. And secondly, he actually increased the literacy rate across the nation by 9 points to about 55, which was more comparable to Pakistan's regional neighbors. Thirdly, he was able to mobilize the Pakistani diaspora in a way that had not been seen previously, particularly amongst the Muhajir community that had felt disenfranchised by many of Pakistan's rulers previously. But he was able to increase their investment by 10-fold, and a lot of people credit Imran Khan's success to the fact that Pakistan's diaspora felt more engaged in the political circle. Fourthly, the economy. Now, Pakistan is a country which is known for the fact that military dictators actually increase economic growth. Now, that was seen in Ayub Khan's era, and Musharraf's era was no different. In the first few years of his tenure, Pakistan was growing at around 4 to 6%, which made it comparable to a lot of strong developing countries, and it was even put into the bucket of N11 countries, which meant the next 11 strong developing economy countries. Now, a lot of foreign direct investment was obviously coming in, as we mentioned, and a lot of initiatives that were started were abruptly halted by the end of his tenure. Finally, peace with India. Now that sounds like something so ridiculous to say, and of course he did by no means definitively achieve it, but a lot of people credit the fact that Musharraf came so close to the fact that he belongs to a community called the Muhajirs, who were of course migrants who came over from India to Pakistan, and so he had a closer affinity to India and was more passionate about making peace with the country than perhaps previous rulers or rulers since Musharraf have been. And he actually came so close that there was a summit in 2004 within India itself where Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the then Prime Minister of India, who belonged to the BJP, and Musharraf sat down and discussed a few issues including Kashmir and the water crisis, and came closer to a deal than had ever been the case. But of course the Mumbai attacks and then subsequent leadership ego battles derailed the process. So now we come to the most important question, which is what legacy does Musharraf leave behind? Now, he is currently on his deathbed within Dubai and he's suffering from Parkinson's, so he probably won't have much more to say on what his legacy is. But where does his tenure leave us? Of course, his proponents would say that much like Ayub Khan and other military dictators that Pakistan has had, he left us with strong economic growth, strong educational investment, and actually led to stronger international ties. But of course, there are those who obviously view him as just a dictator and nothing more, nothing less, someone who eroded the democratic institutions and cancelled the democratic promise of Pakistan. Now, if you move beyond that, I do think that Pakistan has had its watershed moment in Musharraf. I don't think there is an appetite within the population itself to have a military dictator like that, or like Ayub Khan, or like Zia-ul Haq ever again. Since Musharraf's tenure, we've had 3 successive democratically elected governments, all of whom passed on power relatively peacefully between each other. This by no means results in the fact that Pakistan is at where it needs to be. There is a long way to go, and of course a lot of the institutions within Pakistan are still pretty weak and could be usurped by the military establishment if they so chose it. But I do think there has been a turning point in the will of the people who do want democratically elected governors and politicians to do their bidding for them, rather than a strongman military dictator who they perhaps didn't have a voice in choosing. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I've done a couple other ones. One is to do with its relationship with India, and the other one is to do with the identity of Pakistan itself. I'm going to be doing more on these, so please do like and subscribe and leave your comments and thoughts because I'd love to engage with them. Thank you so much for watching.